The topic of today is periodization, and how that, really applies to training. A lot of us, whether we're working with clients on a daily basis, with athletes on a daily basis, or even on ourselves, we're investing a lot of time, effort, and energy, and probably some emotional health, exerting ourselves in the gym, planning for the future. So there's a lot of science behind training. There's a lot of proven methods and ways of operating to really improve efficiency, and also improving results, and improving as a result of improving results and efficiency, also improving the enjoyment of the journey that you're taking, whether for yourself or with a client or with a patient. Working with someone, this will help the overall journey, which is the most important thing. So having said all that, Dr. Jason Miller, the stage is now yours. Give me the cue when to share the presentation, and then that'll be up with you on screen. Thank you for being here today, and good luck. And we'll circle back with you very, very soon.
All right, thank you, Danny. And you actually did a good job of explaining why we'd even periodize something in the first place. So I appreciate the introduction. Again, my name is Jason Miller, currently an assistant teaching professor at Oklahoma State University. Prior to that, I was in another academic position at a smaller university here in Oklahoma. In terms of coaching experience, I've been involved with the field of strength conditioning for over 25 years.
Jason, just to jump in, just because we're so early on, is that noise from your end that's coming through? Maybe
is it chatter in the background?
Yeah, is it?
Yeah, it's probably outside my office. So
I see.
Hopefully it'll die down here in a minute. So
okay,
if not, I can switch over to my microphone. It might be a little bit better. So let me know, and I can make that switch.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, it should die down, hopefully. Grad students. So background coaching, work with various athletes, various individuals. And I've had the opportunity to write a lot of programs. And so in my talk today, I want to kind of demystify, I called my talk Periodization to Mystical Training. And I've actually purposely kept the slides themselves even simple, just because I want to kind of drive home the point that many times we make training harder than it is. As a young coach, I know when I first started, I over-programmed often. When I work with young coaches, usually the first question is, I can do all these things on the floor. I know how to teach this, but I cannot write a program. I'm uncomfortable writing programs. And then even myself, and then as a counsel, I coached a couple of years ago, that I got to the point where they've learned so much, they locked up. So meaning that they got to the point where they were trying to incorporate every idea out there. If you've been around in strength conditioning or training any period of time, you know that there's a lot of debate about what's the best way to set up a training program. So my hope here in these just kind of brief 20 minutes or so is maybe give you some grounding as you start to consider these different programs, and that perhaps, again, things can be a lot simpler than oftentimes they're either portrayed or presented, or even as coaches or individuals when we're making programs, we tend to do this to ourselves as well. So Danny, we can go ahead and start the presentation. All right. So again, mystical training, it's really not that mystical. And that's kind of, again, what I want to drive home today. I put this book reference here. This is an older book on periodization. It's a very thorough book. So after this presentation, if you want to go get a text that does a good job of treating periodization and as a whole, including different areas of training, not just resistance training, but also cardiovascular training, endurance training, as well as speed training. This book is a pretty good treatise on that. So I just want to point you that direction if you want more information. All right. So what is periodization? Let's define this term. Again, it's often kicked around a lot. There's various, maybe you've heard of linear periodization, classical periodization, nonlinear periodization, conjugate training. I mean, there's so many different ideas. What does periodization even mean? You can see periodization in other fields. So in the business world, there's periodization. It just means, in the context of training, it just means organized periods of training. That's it. So that's the slide. And I want to keep it that simple as we move forward, is don't let the word even itself have this kind of mystical connotation, or that writing a training program should be so incredibly difficult, that it's not even worth attempting, right? Or you couldn't even decipher somebody else's program. It's just too difficult. Periodization is just organizing your training, okay? Now, where the complication may come is how you organize the periods, what you actually do in the periods. And I'll talk about the different levels of periodization. This is where you get some of the debate. But even that, those debates that occur, they're often over just a few deviations in theory. Okay, and I'll drive home the point at the end that selecting the right model of periodization will primarily be driven by who you're working with. Okay, so I'll give you kind of okay, what do I do when I'm building a program or selecting a program? What's the first thing I should do? What should I consider? I know periodization is just periods of training. Which one of the models should I follow? I'll give you some direction. But again, a lot of the controversy and a lot of the complication comes in just organizing the periods. Okay, which period is first? Which is next? What do you do during each period? This could be a lecture. We could spend a whole series on this alone, but this is the underpinnings. And what I mean by we could spend a lot of time on it because all the physiology behind it. But the actual concept here, and what I'll tell you what you're looking at here in a second, is what's driving the different periods. Okay, so a lot of you are probably familiar with the slide on the left. This is from I haven't seen another paper that did such a good job with looking at these underpinnings as this article by Chu and Barnes all the way back in 2003. I encourage you to look at that, and that's in the Strength Conditioning Journal. But the panel on the left, and it's a shared image on the top there, that blue line is the classic supercompensation curve. So in other words, the orange area is there's some sort of stimulus, and then there's a dip in performance that occurs. You can see the blue line then goes below that baseline. That would be like baseline fitness of something. And then given enough time and rest, you see a change of performance. You have a supercompensation occur. This is also obviously predicated on Hans Selye's work, Stress of Life. That's where a lot of this information came from. Well, when we are making training programs, that curve is foundational. So keep that in mind. Keep that in your back pocket as you move forward. The complication of periodization can come, though, when we have multiple things to train. So it's not just getting stronger, but maybe it's getting faster. It's not just getting faster, but now there's a technical component to maybe an athlete. Maybe somebody wants to get bigger and more muscular while they're trying to improve their endurance performance. That could be challenging. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see what's called the fitness fatigue theory. And all that is just combining a lot of these different training stimuli and understanding that each one of those stimuli have a different fitness and fatigue curve. So for example, again, I don't want to get in the weeds too far here, but if you do heavy weight training for somebody who's experienced, the amount of fatigue that's incurred is not that long lasting. It may be like somebody did 3 sets of heavy squats. They'll be tired maybe acutely, but they probably could turn around and do something else with their legs, maybe even do some distance training or something like that later in the day. Where if you reverse that and did distance training before you did heavy weight training, you're going to find that the weight training performance and quality is lower. And so I put this slide up here not to make things more complicated because I want to keep things simple, but just to understand that as we periodize things, as we select periods of training, this is where the complication can occur, is the order in which we train, both from block to block or from month to month, but also within a training session. This is where a lot of the thoughtfulness would occur. So again, the purpose of this quick lecture is to, at least on a macro level or a larger level, kind of hopefully demystify that part, but understanding when we actually get into the daily training, things maybe that's where we can add a little bit more complication. Okay. Now, as you think about designing or evaluating a program, and most students I encounter, young coaches, I tell them, don't try to write your first programs. Just get somebody else's and then analyze it, right? Try to see the trends in the model that's being used. That's an easier place to start. Having been a young coach and tried to write all my programs initially, I learned a lot, but it was very painful and it took a lot of time. And so, I encourage young coaches and individuals, not just coaches, but individuals that are writing programs, find a program, but be able to assess it, with these 4 variables. Now, as you start to write programs, what will tend to happen is, again, I mentioned before, is you can get bogged down with overcomplicating things, okay, especially on this larger level of ordering training from, let's say, month to month or from week to week. Always go back to these simple, very simple training basics, right? These are the principles of training, okay? Progressive overload. So does your program have a reasonable progression to it? So as you start to, this model, this periodization model, is there progressive overload? Is it too fast? Perhaps, but is there progressive overload? Is there specificity? Am I going where I need to? If strength is the goal, are we eventually getting to strength? It can be that simple. Individuality. Who is in front of me? where are they starting from? And that can help me select the right program as well. And reversibility. So, how much time I have between each stimuli. Okay. That's one of the parts of periodization that's also often talked about, and rightly so, is, incorporating more rest periods. Some people do not need deload weeks all the time. Okay. And who are those people? More than likely people that are just starting out. All right. So again, when we're looking at this idea of periodization and trying to figure out what model is best, or as you start to coach for a long period of time, if you find yourself getting bogged down, go back to the simple, the basics of exercise prescription, okay, of training principles. Okay, so when we look at periodization, one of the tools it does provide for us is a hierarchy to organize our training. So many of you may be familiar with this already, but you might have a macro cycle level. Some coaches don't use a macro. Sometimes macros are very fluid if you're in the strength conditioning, let's say in an institution or something like that. But a macro cycle typically is a year. I've worked with Olympic athletes, so their macro cycle is a quad. So they have 4-year training cycle. And what that does, it helps you to, let's say with some of those Olympic athletes, I happen to work with rowers. And so, early on, you assess what they're not very good at. They need to get stronger. But by the time they get ready to go to the Olympic Games, a lot of their, there should be more of a focus on power. Now, along the way, it doesn't mean, that it's just strength for the first 2 years and power in the second, but the majority of training is devoted to either one of those variables, depending on what year in the quad that you're in, okay? And then once we get through a macro cycle, you might hear people talk about their mesos. Again, this is where most of the debate occurs in periodization, but these are weekly blocks typically, organized in either 4-week structure or 4-week structures or 6-week structures, depending on which model you use. 4 weeks tends to be a good range, but that's not set in stone. I've done 6-week cycles. I've done 2-week cycles. I've done 12-week cycles, depending on who the individual is. And the microcycles, the day training. Unfortunately, we could talk about sets and reps and all kinds of stuff like that as well, but I won't get in the weeds on that one. Okay, so periodization flow, again, just trying to keep it simple. When you're looking at a periodized program or any program, and this could be weight training, this could be it could be speed training, whatever it may be. Here's just the general flow. Again, keeping it simple. All right, is we go from general to specific. We go from volume to intensity. Okay. If you want to put this in something very practical, you would do more exercises like the old Soviet literature, Soviet Sports Review, and the old literature that's out there. If you've ever seen some of the old texts, some of these athletes were doing like 56 exercises early in their training cycles. Some of them were body weight, handstand push-ups, all kinds of stuff. Okay, think like a very famous training method right now. But then as the athletes got closer to competition, they would move towards specificity. The idea was that you build this large base of movement. You train on the musculature and different movement patterns, and then they could be specific, right? Maybe with 3 exercises as their tactical requirements or their technical requirements increased in their sport. And then, of course, volume to intensity, we could easily think of this like doing sets of 12 to doing sets of 3 over the course of a training cycle, if strength was important. Okay, so again, these are very simple concepts, but that's what I want to focus on is the actual programming itself. When you're not getting into the minutia of the daily, but just thinking about how you're going to organize program is pretty simple. Okay, so again, this is where we get now into some of the controversies and variants. When we start to talk about how we organize volume and intensity, that's what the battle is about. So if you've heard of conjugate training, or you've heard of just a simple linear periodized program, or maybe nonlinear program, what's on the slide here is on the left, you see the larger arrows, large arrow here, right? This is our traditional volume to intensity. And then we might have this back and forth that occurs. Okay, that's more like your nonlinear. That's a great thing to do during, let's say, a sports season. So you might have, sets that are, I'm just using sets and reps because they're easy to think about. You might move from sets of 10 all the way down to sets of 3 and 4, but then you might jump back up to sets of 8 and then jump back. And this could be within a week. Sometimes it's called flexible undulating periodization. But the point is that there's just this undulation that occurs between volume and intensity. Over here is the very simplified version of what's called the conjugate method, made famous by Westside Barbell. And again, this could be a separate topic unto itself, but essentially there's a volume buildup, and then there's this back and forth between intensity and some sort of speed. And so intensity here could be load, so you get speed, strength, speed, but you have these variants going on within the week. Okay, the blocks though are still could still be building over time, like in terms of intensity and volume is coming down. What really made this program famous, and I think is very effective, this is something I subscribe to, not necessarily the conjugate method all the way, but is exercise selection. So in a conjugate program, the individuals would go to failure and basically try to set a new max. Not necessarily go to complete failure, but let's say if the bench press is important, this is a powerlifting background, you might do an incline press and try to work up to a new record on the incline press. So it's close to the bench, but it's not the bench. So we're not going to do the bench, but we're going to do some sort of variant. So there's a lot of exercise rotation. Now, obviously that, if you think about a junior high kid, this is probably not a good program for them. So, as you start to look at these programs, you can already start to think about, well, what would make sense for the people in front of me? Okay. And that's kind of where we're heading here, is like the conjugate program has been pushed a lot lately. And again, I like the program, but think of these as you're choosing the right program. Don't get bogged down in trying to become, I only do this. This is my advice to you. You can do whatever you want, but don't become, I only do this type of programming. I only do that type of programming. Think of this as more of a menu of which one of these programs do I select? Okay. And as you assess the programs, you'll see these very simple schematics start to, in your mind, you'll start to see how volume and intensity are being manipulated. And you could say, you know what, that doesn't make any sense for the athlete I have in front of me. Okay. Or the individual I have in front of me. This may not make a lot of sense, to have volume and intensity going back and forth within a week, but may make sense to have that going back and forth within months of training if you're working with the general population that just wants to gain some muscle mass and get stronger. Okay. And here's just another model. This is called block training. I didn't label these just so you can see how simple they are, but volume to intensity, these are just blocks of volume and intensity, and then you start over. Now, this line may not, kind of the same as this one, but you might not go all the way back to the volume you started with, but you just essentially dovetail these blocks together. All right. This was made famous by a Russian author, Asurin, where he would put these guys. I like these a lot. I would do 6-week blocks. This is where you get into the minutia a little bit, but you can get in terms like realization, transformation, right, accumulation. But essentially, all this is just volume intensity manipulation. So again, my hope is as we demystify periodization a little bit, we just realize all we're doing is messing with volume and intensity. That's it. We're just messing with volume and intensity. Okay. All right. So sum this up. Okay. Here's some. There's a whole. Sorry about that. There's a whole series. Please don't restart my computer. There's a whole series that we're putting together on training theory, and so I'm going to just kind of wrap this up here so I can take questions. But here's some general advice, and let me start with this. One of the important things to do initially is define who's in front of you. I've mentioned that a few times, and so understanding the individual's training level. Are they a novice? Are they intermediate? Or are they advanced? Now, if you ask most people who've trained for a fairly long period of time, they will tell you they're advanced. And reality is there's only a fraction of people who are advanced trainees. The best definition I have seen of this was from a weightlifting coach. He passed away 5 years ago, but Glenn Penlay, he did a great job. The Penlay method is a good book to read if you, even if you're not interested in weightlifting, it's just a good book on training. But understanding what each one of these categories means. So for a novice trainer, think about somebody who could train on Tuesday, and by the time they train, even if it's the same exercises, they might be stronger in those same exercises by Friday. Like it's that fast. Okay. Or somebody who's an intermediately trained or intermediate trainee, they might train on 1 week, but they won't see the gains for it until the next week. Okay, so there's going to have to be some more thoughtfulness put in. An advanced person, though, that's where a lot of these books you read, like Super Training and some of these really good books, and these are heavy reads. But now you're talking about athletes that might do a month's worth of training just to see any gains. Okay, so that's a good way of thinking about who's in front of me. Your average high school athlete in the United States, no matter how long they've trained, is probably a novice to intermediate. Okay, so just that'll help, I think, when then you start to select a program. You probably don't need a really fancy program, and that's why I have this next little verbiage in here. The simpler the training, the simpler the program. You're going to spend more time instructing exercises and teaching new exercises and instructing good movement and establishing mobility and balance. There's more floor coaching involved than there is with an advanced athlete. You would hope at that point has at least some movement proficiency. They probably still have some mobility challenges potentially, but They will also, though, that advanced athlete or the intermediate to advanced athlete is going to need more thoughtful programming. That's when you're going to have to pull out the more complicated programs. Otherwise, you may not need that conjugate program for the junior high kid. And that's why I wrote in here a 1x20 program, a simple ramp. If you're familiar with ACSM guidelines, you may think those are too simple. They work. Okay, if you took somebody just starting out, I love the 1x20 program. That's essentially a general preparatory program, tons of exercises, going one set to failure. Obviously exercises that the individual can be proficient in, but build a big base, right? Build a big base. And then as needed, you see the line there, as an individual moves from novice to intermediate, then you can start to incorporate a periodization model. And I would highly recommend, again, we don't have time to talk about all of them in depth, but just a simple linear model works great, meaning you go from volume that's high to intensity low over time to intensity high, volume low, and then reset it at some point. Okay, if it's an athlete, obviously that could lead up to a competition. All right, whatever model you select, let's say you are a high school or you work with high school athletes. Okay, and for most of those athletes, if you had, let's say if you're coaching at 50 athletes, it's a lot. If you can individualize, great. But let's say you 1x20 is working with those athletes. Those athletes are avoiding injury. They're getting stronger and getting faster. There's no need to try to dabble in something more complex. Keep it simple. As a coach, I've gone on this arc, like I mentioned before, of learn everything, overcomplicate everything. And I think if you talk to most coaches and you see a lot of their programs, the programs are really simple because you come back to it's less about these really complex ideas. It's just about reinforcing progressive over specificity, right? What's the simplest way I can do that and communicate that to athletes in the simplest program that gives them the results, okay? And my last comments on there, if it's, again, avoid the shiny object syndrome, which is related to if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You got something that's working, whatever metrics you're using, strength, speed, whatever it is, you're seeing progression or avoiding, lowering the likelihood of injury. You don't need to dabble in a bunch of other ideas and new periodization models and waste the time doing so. There's an opportunity cost associated with that if you're getting the results that you need. I see a lot of coaches chasing shiny objects all the time when the program they have has been working really well for the population that's in front of them. So that's all I have you. I know it's a lot in a short period of time. Tried really hard to stay out of the weeds. I hope that's helpful in some way, just to simplify, at least as we approach periodization, to simplify. I left a few things on here. Here's some books. I mentioned block periodization. I already showed you the book by Bompa. The 1x20 method's been around a very long time. Ripito and Kilgore, Practical Programming. It's a good book if you're feeling overwhelmed. It's a good place to start. I know some, again, we see names. Some of you have been in strength conditioning, you see names and you might have pushback on some of them. I don't like that person. Or just take the ideas if you don't like the individual and see how you might incorporate them. Ripito does a good job of explaining like simple ramps. He'd be a good one to read for novice to intermediate. And then as you move from novice and 1x20, obviously with novices, and then as you move from into the intermediate phase, the block periodization and the Bompa book is a good one. And then as you move to advanced, you might find the block periodization method really helpful, as well as I mentioned, I put the cube method up here. It's part of that conjugate group, right? That's a great method as well. So hopefully that was more helpful than hurtful. I did muddy the waters a little bit, but maybe start to simplify some of these concepts. I think we can hear you, Danny.
I was on mute, sorry. Okay. On your, just the way you ended that. So in terms of shaking the waters, I'm not sure exactly what you said there. So why is there so much maybe like debate over the different methodologies? Is it is it politics, or is it just because people competing for whose method is best? Because as you said, is because monitoring seems like to be key for any program that anyone puts together. So if you are seeing results, with the population that's in front of you, should one be paying attention to criticisms coming, to the method that you chose to maybe base your program around?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the first part is, why do we have all these ideas? Because I think a lot of them work. So the old saying, there's a lot of roads that lead to Rome, right? There's a lot of ways to do training effectively. You could do a conjugate method with your junior high team and they would see results. My contention though is I could probably get the same results and maybe it'd be less stressful on the athletes and do a simple 1x20 training program. That's part of the evaluating a program is I can get, again, if I get athletes to the same place, but I subjected them to a lot of load. And this is one of my kind of pet peeves when I see coaches working with young athletes, is it doesn't take much for them to see gains. There's no need to throw them under a heavy barbell. And I love the barbell. I was a weightlifting coach, still am, right? So I love the barbell, but there's no need to put them under that duress and compress their spines and do all that stuff if we don't have to. What if we could do a hex bar or even a machine if it fit their body, right? And there's problems with kids and machines, but I think that's one of my things when we look at these models. Well, and social media, right, has made things, what's the new sexy thing, right?
The bro science.
Bro science, but even people who are really good coaches and thoughtful, when they post something, right, it's just different, so it looks cool. We're all tend to gravitate. I look at these things, and I would highly encourage. I'm not saying shut your mind off and don't consider things. What I tell students and young coaches is move at a glacier's pace, meaning move, right? There maybe you need to evaluate some things, but glaciers don't move very fast. So when you see the new shiny object come up, don't chase it, read about it, consider it. How's my program been doing? Man, I'm getting the results I really want, but maybe there's a component that let's be very specific. Like I don't know how my shoulder care program is, or okay, well, this is a new idea. Let me consider that, right? But we haven't had a lot of injuries in that area, so why would I completely overhaul everything if I've accomplished what I want to with my program? Now, obviously, if I have a program that's failing in some way, or it could happen that you get different groups. Maybe you have a bunch of, I'm putting athletics, but you have a bunch of older athletes and the program really worked. And then you have a group of younger athletes now, maybe within a team or something like that. And you notice the program isn't as effective. Well, now you have maybe two sets of programs, either within that group or that you use depending on what you see in front of you. Well, this is the younger group. I know this program's probably going to be a little better. This is the older group. I know this program's effective. And then somebody says, hey, try this thing. It's like, well, hold on a minute. My metrics say that this works pretty well, but let me listen to what you have to say though. Right. So I think it's a combination. I do too. We tend to chase shiny objects, and with social media, we get lots of shiny objects thrown at us all the time. And so I think, go ahead.
No, so you think a lot of, different strength and conditioning coaches, personal trainers, sometimes overcomplicating, like starting from an overcomplicated program to begin with versus simple and then growing from there if you don't see the results that maybe you're chasing.
Exactly. And so, when I work with young coaches, always the angst is always programming. It's like, go back to the simple, even if you took the ACSM guidelines, I'm not saying they're great for everything, but you were a great floor coach. Like you really knew how to coach exercises, and you knew how to adjust and scale and do all those little things in the weight room, and you still were doing sets of 8. Those athletes or individuals will get more out of those sets of 8 by your proficiency in technique. And I know there's I've seen this thing lately, like, well, technique doesn't matter. People just get stronger. Like, okay, but tell that person that 10 years later. This is why I really get frustrated when I hear that with like young athletes, that are turtle backing as they're doing front squats and their spine is loaded. And it's like, okay, so they're training their upper erectors when we should be training quads. So that technique does matter. I don't agree with that at all. But that's a new shiny object thing, right? Well, I just lift heavy things and it'll all work out. So again, be a good floor coach. That's my encouragement. No exercise. Don't be afraid to push people. People aren't just fragile, but we can be really good floor coaches and get the most out of every rep. Like velocity training. I like that. Velocity-based training. Make the reps count. Make them high quality. And if you do that, your overall programming, even if you feel like it's not as proficient as you like, or you'll still see results because you're seeing progressive overload, right? You're training the muscles in the way that you want to. You're being specific to the way you want them trained, and you're training the individual. I mean, that's the name of the game.
Can you expand on the 1x20 method?
Sure. I know it. So, as a young coach, I remember seeing that and I was like, that's dumb. You gotta lift 5x5. What a stupid program. But it was written by a man who has been around. Dr. Yessis has been around a long time. And that doesn't mean he knows what he's doing. There's a lot of people who've been around a long time. They're terrible. So there's a logical fallacy there, I realize. But the point is that he's trained a lot of athletes, and it's like, okay, I'll give this thing a fair shake. And the more you start to look at, he's obviously well-versed in the old Soviet literature. But the idea is that, especially and I say young athletes, I don't mean just biologically young. It could be, masters athletes have exploded, right? There's more masters athletes than there ever has been, especially in Europe and the United States. But you want to establish a base. And again, it's one of those things that if I can do 30, right, that's a lot, I realize, but 30 exercises really well and work the body and all the different musculature and different patterns, and build that big base, and to the point where I'm really addressing all these small weaknesses I might have. Maybe I have this issue with my lower traps, and if I just jumped in and started doing traditional weight training without this big broad base, I'm always going to have that issue with my lower traps, and so it's going to affect my shoulder later on. But if I do this 1x20 training and I'm just starting out, I'm probably getting stronger everywhere, and then those areas that I'm the weakest are going to come up the fastest. And so now I have this nice base, and I've got stronger. And because I'm more of a novice trainer, I'm going to get faster. I'm going to feel better. I'm going to be stronger overall in every movement. I'm going to have bigger muscles, whatever it is I'm chasing. If that's working, again, I go back to this, like say it's as a young athlete, if that's still working and the individual is getting the metrics that you want, there's no need to change that, because we're just bringing up their total fitness. Now, what we can do then, the beauty of that is, if you say, well, now I need to really work on lower body strength. Like, we need to do some more of that, or that's, obviously speed training, things like that might be over the top of this, but now I can really narrow. But I have this big base where a lot of those muscles that serve as stabilizers, neutralizers, all those type of things, they're strong. And so now I can move through those movement patterns like a squat more proficiently and stay injury free than if I had not done the 1x20 training. So I'm a big fan of it now, and it's about as simple as a program as you can get. I've seen more and more people using it, especially a novice and young.
So I love this. What does it look like? What does it look like technically?
So it's one set. So it depends on when somebody starts. You might be using reps maybe around 14, but you build up to 20. You could jump right into 20. You're going to failure. So you have to make sure you have to select exercises that make sense, right? Now, it doesn't have to be, certainly not technical failure, right? So we'd have to define failure a little bit. Like if somebody was doing a squat pattern, it'd probably be silly to do that with a barbell, but we could do it with some dumbbells or something like that. But the real crux of it is you have this expanse of patterns. So I could do a couple different squat variations within the 1x20. I might do pulling exercise, but I mentioned before, I might do some face pulls, and I might do some traditional rows, and I might do some lat pull down. So I get this big menu, and so the whole body is
but it's one set per one of those exercises to max. So usually
to max 20, right? And what's the load like at 20 then? Not real heavy. So even if we have technical flaws and breaks, they won't be as catastrophic as if somebody is doing like a heavy set of 3 or something.
But it can still be like 3 times 20 of 3 different squat variations.
You probably want to use the different variations.
Yeah.
So again, without getting the weeds, if you kind of look at the arc of training, then like what Louis Simmons did with Conjugate, he kind of did the same thing, but on the other side with heavy stuff. So he said, now let's do sets where we're going to go up to singles, but we're going to have exercise variant. And I'm a huge exercise variance person, even in well-trained athletes. The only time I might not do a lot of exercise variance is where, like, with the last 3 weeks to a competition or something like that, I probably won't do a huge amount of variance, but exercise variance is a big deal. I think it's an undervalued thing. And where does that come into play? Floor coaching, right? Your exercise selection, that is not a periodization model. It's just understanding exercise.
So you touched on competition, and competition seems to me like for many strength and conditioning coaches, fitness coaches, personal trainers, it can be very much in the way of your planning on your periodization, especially if it's, it's starting from a complex point where, maybe it's almost limiting you, the competition, because, there's a level of competition where you want to avoid injuries. You want the athletes to, show up at, peak energy and peak, just being injury free and ready to go, right? You want them at their best when the competition day arrives. So considering competition into a training program, should the results be monitored more, loosely, or just expecting progress in a slower rate when you're working with athletes that have regular competition? Like, I'm speaking from my experience where, like, as a soccer player, where every weekend you have something going on for 9-10 months out of the year.
Yeah. So Yes. Yeah, it's definitely different. So those models we saw, this is where, again, understanding to say, I'm not a conjugate method person. This is just a tool for me to use at the right time. So one of the things one of the models I might use then, it's been coined, I know this vernacular's died off a little bit, probably because we can simplify it, but it used to be called flexible undulating periodization. That's probably why it died off, because it's just a mouthful of nothingness. But essentially what that means is that, okay, if you saw my slideshow, when we looked at the fitness fatigue model, knowing that there's different training stimuli that have a different fatigue and fitness decay, right? So I might look at, as a soccer player, if you play twice a week, let's say, or once a week, or whatever it may be, right? If you have a basketball player, maybe they play 3 times a week, right? Certain tournament seasons like that. Sometimes those weeks might be, I'm really not going to load the athlete very much at all. We just need to recover, right? So any workout we do in the weight training setting would be more of a recovery workout. We might do a wider variety of exercises, but not to failure, right? It's more about blood flow and recovery. But let's say we're in a kind of a traditional like conference season or something like that, where you have a two game schedule or whatever it is. You would say, all right, this is where you understand those fatigue curves and say, okay, if I lift heavy weights today, what happens 3 days later when the game happens? Well, maybe that bumps performance, right? Okay, maybe I can move it to 2 days. So it's more, there's less kind of formal construction there, and you apply more, instead of like a formal periodized model, you just understand decay rates, and you understand what does the athlete need, and understanding like strength kind of decays after about a week. So I probably need to get a heavy something in once a week if I can, right? But I probably won't bust out a big high volume training, because this is one of my terms, volume builds and volume kills, right? So I probably wouldn't go, a whole bunch of new volume. Does that make sense? So
yeah.
I work on what I need to work on. If I had a bunch of basketball players, I probably don't do a plyometric program in the middle of the season. That would be silly, especially for the ones that are playing a lot. Like, I don't need to do this. So again, the season kind of muddies the water. And you're right, in terms of seeing progression and speed, strength, and all those different things, it's more about trying to hold those things. It is possible to see progress, but it may be in like little stops and starts. So a Division I basketball season, right? It starts in the fall. It's like when I work with some Division I basketball players, they started in the fall. We build up, we peak up, as the season starts, they're strong, they're fast, and then we just try to hold on. And then when Christmas break comes, when they have some time down, right, then I might hit them with a couple rounds of volume, especially if they're going to go home or something like that. I know they might not train. Then I'll switch my focus and say, let's go ahead and do some volume training. This is our chance to get this in again and kind of reset the periodized idea before we build back up to intensity again when you come back. And then we're going to go off into the longer part of the season. So, it's more of a flexible, right, idea, and just finding those holes in the schedule when you can plug in the variable that you need most.
Beautiful. Yeah. I want to follow up on that in something also in terms of the flexibility of the programs. But this is the time for everyone that's in the audience. You can type in any questions you have, either in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen, or on the Q&A tab, also on the right-hand side of your screen. So any questions you have, please type them in. Don't be shy. I will read them out to Jason, and he'll answer them here fully. But to continue that, maybe the ultimate water muddier is an injury that occurs in an athlete or someone who's training throughout a program. So, and that seems to me complicated to adapt a training program when someone suffers an injury. And, even if it's, minor, injuries like a hamstring tweak, or, something in the hip that's disturbing an athlete. Because a lot of the times, again, also from personal experience, where when also from the athlete's point of view, it's a lot of the times, if you do have a small calf strain or hamstring strain, it's very noticeable when you try and sprint on the soccer field or the basketball field.
Sure.
But sometimes, that those first few sets of squats might feel great, but then you're still risking yourself, and you still might feel that something pop or tweak that's uncomfortable. And then where do you start from? When do you pick up? You're going to take a break now. Do you start from scratch? So it seems complicated when involving injuries into the flexibility of
Sure.
these training programs.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors, right? So what joint, if it's a lower body athlete, which more than likely it is, because most athletes are, is it the ankle? Is it the hip? What is it? Is it an acute injury? Is it a chronic injury? Again, you mentioned the severity of it. Where are we in the season? Can this athlete take a little bit of time off, or are we trying to get him back really quickly? He or she back to the field or the court very, very quickly. Obviously, I know you have a lot of rehabilitation science folks in the crowd, so there are protocols and kind of timetables that have expectation with each one of those injuries. As a strength coach, then when that athlete is quote unquote cleared, it depends on how long they've been out, right? So obviously, if somebody had an ACL reconstruction, we're talking about a complete reboot. A lot of focus on asymmetry issues, right? You have to be careful with symmetrical training, like doing a bilateral squat, right? I'm not even talking about barbell squat, but it's just reestablishing that symmetry. A lot of athletes that have been hurt for a long period of time, and again, all those in the audience will know this, is the tendency is to overstretch the limb that's been injured because they're focused on getting back. So if somebody has an ACL injury, and man, they have tremendous hamstring and quad flexibility in that limb that's been injured, and so now they have a symmetry the other way, where they have a leg that still has, I'll call it sports stiffness, and they have another leg that doesn't anymore. So again, it's just a lot of things, and in terms of like a periodized model, and that first phase would be just trying to reestablish as much symmetry as possible. Now, I will say, whether it's a short-term or long-term injury, one of the things that I see improving, if there would be a critique of rehabilitation and incorporating periodization, is many times it's reestablishment of range of motion, which makes sense. But then there's this, maybe this phase where it's more volume training, let's say with low resistance. So like early periodization, right? Band training, light machine training, all that stuff's great. But then the move is to go to plyo training, right? To return to, there's something missing. So if we're talking about a periodized sequence, we're missing a strength training phase. Yep. So if we just look at the power equation, right? P equals F times V. Sometimes it seems like we skip over the F and go right to the V. We go right to the velocity training. So, one thing that what I'm getting is when you're rehabilitating somebody, even though they may be cleared to play or cleared back to activity, have they reestablished their strength? Now, and if you're in the middle of the season, it's probably gonna be difficult to get them all the way back to what their pre-camp, pre-season numbers were. But this is where exercise selection can help. If somebody's not ready to do heavy barbell back squats and they haven't been doing that, and you only have a couple weeks to get them back, this is where having your exercise selection knowledge can be helpful, and maybe incorporating some single leg work to increase their strength before they go out and do high velocity movements. So when we talk about injuries, that's one of the biggest things I would promote. And I know a lot of times that the turnaround time is really quick, with these athletes. So it's hard to have a whole strength phase before you send them out. But there should be some thoughtfulness, even if they are returning to play, is, are we getting their strength back? Again, especially if there's even a more acute injury in a shorter time frame, their flexibility may have been improved in that injured limb as well, because they spend so much time rehabilitating it. They need to recover some of that good sports stiffness and strength before they go do high velocity movements. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the mystic periodization, is it underestimated its role in acting as a catalyst for injury prevention?
I think so, and I use the word mystic just because I'm just kind of being silly. But
no, I know. I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I mean, like you read a blog post, and everybody's like, I don't, there are people are arguing over these models, and again, I'm telling you what to do too, so you can totally let this go too. But my advice would be view these things as tools, these models as tools, rather than becoming a disciple of one of them, right? I only follow Conjugate for, okay, well, you're missing out on, right? So, but that's the mystical part. But in terms of avoiding injury, lowering the likelihood of injury, there's been a shift certainly in strength conditioning, and it started really in the professional ranks, a movement away from, the metrics being how strong is somebody's bench press, right, to how many minutes have they missed, okay? Mm-hmm. And so which is a good metric. I mean, it's like I tell students all the time, if you're a coach and you have an All-American on your team, if that All-American gets hurt, you're going to lose. That's just sports. I mean, I don't care how much team you have. You might not lose all your games, but you're going to, you're not going to probably win a championship. That's just the way sports works.
Yeah.
Right. And so, when we look at programs, I'm not even the All-Americans, but none of the athletes gets hurt, obviously, but you can periodize a program in such a way, you say, like, let's talk about those young athletes. What's the best way to help them reduce the likelihood of injury? Well, probably not peak them really early with heavy stuff. Like, what I mean by that, like, go right to a heavy barbell back squat. It'd probably be a better idea for that young athlete to have this big repertoire of movement that they're strong in at the 1x20, some variant of 1x20 training. That would help reduce the likelihood of injury more than, well, if I just get really, really strong in the back squat, okay, that's helpful, but you even may have second. This is just me, okay? So yeah. You guys watching this, maybe I'm wrong, but I hope I'm wrong. But in the next, the pendulum went from, hey, kids can't lift weights. Sorry, I'm on my tangent here. Kids can't lift weights because we're worried about growth plate fractures, which turned out to be wrong, right? A lot of that was misinformation. But now we've shifted all the way over here. Like, kids can just do whatever they want. It's like, hold on a minute. I get concerned sometimes when we see biologically young athletes that we're going to see a lot of spinal issues with them as they get older because of some of the training that we've swung back over here instead of saying somewhere in the middle. Is like, this isn't, and this is why it's probably not done. It's not very sexy to say, hey, do 20 exercises with different but I want to get under a heavy barbell. Okay, well, this is going to serve you better here, right? And we become an older athlete. Now you can, do those heavy back squats, whatever, and your body can bear up under that load. Play your long high school seasons, and your body is, been tissue prepped for the last 4 years with all these different movement patterns. You're more likely. Because
you mentioned the macro cycle of of some like a Olympian where it's a 4-year macro cycle, but then each of us has a macro cycle, which is our life, right?
Yeah.
And so you can mess things up for yourself in that macro cycle in those early years, and it's very heartbreaking. Just walk into an average gym. And just to see people performing, heavy load exercises.
Not ready for it.
But also, even if they were, like, not very good technique, generally speaking, even if you go into a Division I, weight room, a lot of the time, it's either the athletes themselves are not taking it seriously enough, whatever the cause is, but you see bad technique. But still an egotistical maybe desire to rack the bar with more plates and show everyone that you can do these different things by trying to meet these metrics of like you mentioned, bench press, squats, and that type of thing. So with kids in the weight room, is it somewhere in between where we used to be versus where we are now? It's just kids can do weight training.
Oh yeah, I mean, and so don't misunderstand. I don't have a problem with kids lifting barbells and dumbbells. The question is though, do they have to? That's always a thing. So I'll tell you, as a young weightlifting coach, I would have kids 13, maybe younger, doing barbell back squat, and it just hit me one day, like, okay, working with these kids long enough, they're growing, right? They're getting stronger anyway. What if I just did a hex bar and just unloaded their spine? And keep in mind, these are weightlifters, so they're going to have to receive a barbell on their body at some point.
Yeah.
Okay. But in terms of like a barbell back squat, could I lower the risk and might have to do some front squats because that's part of the sport, but could I take the bar off of them and just get them just as strong with a hex bar or in some other ways? That's kind of what I'm getting at. I'm not saying that young people can't lift weights, but let's say if I had soccer players though, do I have to barbell back squat them just because I can? Why would I subject them to that if I don't have to, if I end up in the same place? And that's a lot of these models. Let me give you an example from kind of a periodization world. This is more conditioning, but there was I can't remember what year it is anymore. It was a great study in sprint kayakers. So not a sport that many think about, but what was really cool about the study is they took international level, like Olympic medal winners, which is very hard to get these individuals, right, obviously, into a study. And they did 2 tracks. And so the one track, 2 different training blocks. So the one periodized model was, in their conditioning, was more voluminous. Kind of like, let's think of it like your traditional, like long and slow, right? List training type of stuff, right? So you're doing your, this is not what they did, but you do your 20-minute run, right? And then the other group did more of their time in the high intensity groups, more like HIIT training, HIIT, right? So you're in a, interval training we're all familiar with now. And then they followed these two groups through and then looked at their fitness level after these cycles. And it turns out their cardiovascular fitness was exactly the same between both groups. So this is what I'm getting at with tools. Both of them worked. So as to say the long and slow training, to say that doesn't work, it does work. What was the kicker though, is the amount of volume each group did. The group that did the high intensity training had, I think it was 25% less training volume. So what does that mean? Well, it means that they could be doing other things like recovering, right? And so that's what I'm getting at with like the kids thing. It's the same thing. It's like if I don't have to do that, why would I, right? If I can get them just as strong doing something with dumbbells, and not compressing their spine, why would I not do that? I think I'm hoping that's kind of the next phase working with
because we're also in general, not just with youth athletes, it seems like, industry wise, there is, generally speaking, an emphasis on intensity, and not only looking right at the volume. So like, I want to do 100 push-ups in a row, not whatever, 20 sets of 5.
Yeah. And you've seen even like guys that are more in the powerlifting world. It's been, I think this is already happening, because there's some thoughtful strength coaches out there. Don't get me wrong. It's like, I know there's some in the audience too. Like, well, I do that with you. Yeah, I'm with you. So I think the change's happening, but like powerlifting coaches has new thing is 135 pounds, moving all these different patterns. You should be able to do 3 sets of 10 or somewhere in that range of a certain load and all these patterns first. Again, we're kind of moving back to the 1x20 training, right? Things go in cycles. Right. And so I wouldn't be surprised in the next few years that 1x20 training is one of the more popular methods. This is just my wager. I hope it is, especially for young athletes. Again, I have no problem with peaking and lifting heavy weights and doing all those things. I just would, again, my thing is always, do you have to? I always tell my students, I can come up next to you, let's say in a weight room, and say, what are you doing? And I might disagree with you, but if you give me a good reason why you're doing it, okay, that's a good place to be. But I would argue a lot of times when we work with youth athletes, there isn't a good reason. It's just, well, this is what we do, right? We just lift heavy stuff. It's like, okay, could we do it in a little different way that doesn't hurt this young person? Maybe they don't go on to be a great athlete anyway. They're going to be 40 one day and maybe appreciate that you didn't, I'm not an overcautious person, to be honest. I'm pretty aggressive in the weight room, but I can do that well within the bounds of good exercise selection. That's why I keep going back. Exercise selection is such a big deal.
I personally, I do something like at least once a week, like the 1x20 method, but with body weight exercises just for myself, but tackling different variations of exercises. And I actually find it the easiest workout to get through from a psychological perspective, because it's so dynamic. I'm never repeating, set 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm never repeating anything. So I also find it very fun. So it's a good one to play with.
We're not allowed to have fun when you train, right? You're supposed to throw up in the corner, and there's still that around, right? And we've talked a little about this too, Danny, in sets and rep schemes even. Part of, especially athletes that have been training a long time, a lot of times when I program, let's say we are doing squats at that point, barbell back squats. This is where things, and I don't want to go into the weeds here, this is a little bit off topic, but like wave training and things like that. Where you do a lighter load and then a heavier load on the bar, and the reps may be changed. So let's say you want to average 80% if we use percentage-based training. I might do a set that's 75% and then a set that's 85%, right? So the average is 80, probably wouldn't be that spread. But just having the athletes take the bar on and off take the weights on and off the bar and feel a little bit lighter weight, the 85 feels a little bit lighter, and that, if you've ever done 3 sets of 5, that second set is awful because you're like, this is not the last one. And it hurts. Well, the third one's like, what's the last one? So I feel great. And the first one's, you're just kind of getting in the groove. Well, if you did a wave training, you break that monotony. And I think that's such an underrated thing in training, because we kind of, we get into these kind of modes where this is the only thing I'm allowed to do in terms of exercise selection. I told you earlier, if you find a program that works, keep doing it. I'm not talking about the program. I'm talking about the exercise selection. It's okay to have some variance there to keep the athlete, and I use this term, entertained. Their neuro drive is going to be higher if they're excited to train, right? And so like you doing your body weight circuit, you probably get more caloric expenditure if that was the goal, or just general tissue prep work by having that variant, then if you went in and did the same, dumbbell program that you've done for the last 3 weeks, you know what I mean? Like that variance is a big deal.
Yeah.
That's something Louis with Westside Barbell did a pretty good job with too. And he just did it with really heavy weights and elite power lifters, but there's an incorporation of that. I think that's why conjugate training has become so popular. And that's more on the intermediate advanced end though. That's not for novices where we have the 1x20 training. So
fantastic. Good. And very useful just to building a base before anything.
Build a base.
Yeah.
Most people don't need to go beyond that base, really. That's why Glenn Penley did a good job of, like, he was a weightlifting coach. Why overcomplicate things until you have to? Don't complicate them.
Fantastic. So it's almost like, less is more, simpler is more.
Yes.
Right. As cliche as it is.
Spend all your energy on learning how to teach exercises well and variance well. I'd spend more time on that. I'm not saying don't understand program. I'm just saying if I was going to allocate a percentage of my time as a practitioner, if I had to pick between programming and exercises, I would spend 70% of my time, because I can always get a program, and just what I said earlier is look at, is there a progressive overload, is there specificity? But you see, it's like in high school coaches, they'll pick a program, maybe if it's a good program, but then they sit in on their phone. I'm not saying all coaches do this, but it's just an extreme example. But if you sat there on your phone and didn't coach the athletes through it, and I saw this in colleges too, so like smaller universities, the coach just kind of gives them a program. It's like, well, the program isn't going to, if they can't back squat, I know I'm picking on back squat, but if they can't barbell back squat properly, it doesn't matter how great the program is. You can't coach them on the floor. So anyway.
So Jason, thank you very much. I told you it's so easy to fill up 60 minutes on this information because you can talk about it for a very long time.
Especially a professor that talks too much anyway. So.
Exactly. But thank you very much. It was, super valuable and useful because, again, our goal is for every individual, whatever it is they're pursuing, so whatever the population is in front of any coach or personal trainer is, again, we want people to progress, develop, and not get hurt. So it makes sense to everyone to just start from a point of planning and test your plans, test your programs, and if they work, stick with them, and if they don't, adapt, as simple as that sounds. But also for many different reasons, sometimes egotistical, sometimes laziness, sometimes unawareness, it's difficult to keep your hand on the pulse and adapt as necessary, especially when working maybe with a team or multiple athletes and not just one-on-one where you can give everyone your full attention 24/7. But that's super valuable. So thank you very, very much. The webinar and this live class was recorded, so anyone that registered, even if you were on here today, you'll receive a recording of this 60-minute lecture and the conversation that we had. It'll also be posted on our website, on our live class section, and will also be posted on our YouTube channel. So please keep your eyes open for it. Please keep your eyes open also for our online course that will be released sometime in the next couple of months. Very, a heavy emphasis on resistance training, the theory behind it, but also application and practical, tips and ideas that can really help you as a professional practitioner develop. If you haven't subscribed, followed us on social media, the podcast, please do so. You'll stay up to date with everything that's going on in our ecosystem. I mentioned it's worth following just for, we publish on a daily basis, free information, free videos, free articles, blogs all the time. So please follow us and gain the most out of it. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any feedback, any questions. To us at Neil Asher Education, to myself, or to Dr. Jason Miller. Feel free to reach out to us. Our email is, you can reach us at support@neilasher.com. You can also find the contact help page on our website where you can leave your information and we'll get back to you within a few hours. So thank you very much for everyone who joined today and spent this hour with us. I'm wishing everyone, wherever you are in the globe, a great weekend. And Dr. Jason Miller, thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Have a great weekend.
You too.